passion and pageantry of college football lives here. This is the Paul Finebaum Show, Hour 1 podcast.
This might be college football heaven.
Friday has arrived. We thank you for joining us, and we're here only for 4 hours. If you can spare some change. Good afternoon. A lot happening. Still more fallout from the Big Ten SEC meeting. We'll get to that right away. Some other things are happening as we begin the weekend. But let's start with this. What's going on here? Texas, USC, others perhaps to join spring football. Remember when that used to be the gathering place every spring? Schools don't want it anymore. You can understand why Sark doesn't want one. He played a very long schedule. Not really sure about Lincoln Riley. We'll talk about it a little bit later on. There's another meeting. Commissioners always have someplace to go this time of the year. That's college football playoff expansion. So what did the impact, will the impact of New Orleans have? We'll talk to John Wilner, one of the most plugged-in people in intercollegiate athletics. He'll join us 1 hour from now. Remember when Matt Rule was mouthing off recently about how great the Big Ten is? He forgot to talk about his own school and how they are cowardly backing out of a series in 2 years with the University of Tennessee. I remember when Nebraska beat Tennessee regularly. Now they don't want any part of it. Danny White responded to a Thamel tweet about the two sides canceling. He said, Tennessee's not canceling this series. Nebraska did. We are disappointed they didn't want to play these games. In other words, Nebraska didn't want to lose to an SEC school. I thought we were going to try to ameliorate some of those issues. Seth Emerson with this in The Athletic. He covered the big meeting this week. What about 9 games? We've been on this precipice for years. Can't seem to get over the top. What about now? Seth joins us. Seth, I can't tell you how many times we have talked about this issue with you and others. So good afternoon. Tell us where we are in terms of finally turning the page to 9 conference games.
Well, Paul, for about the millionth time, the SEC is on the verge of going to 9 games. So, yeah, that's basically where it stands. I've given up on saying that it absolutely is happening. But the vibe we got from New Orleans and talking to people is that it's likely. But the first thing they need is this playoff format to be finalized. And if the format goes to 14 teams, or 16, but 14 seems to be the most likely number now, with more importantly, the 4 guaranteed spots for the SEC and the Big Ten, then that would probably follow with the SEC going to 9 games. Because the chief objection has gone from ESPN not giving the SEC more money for adding a 9th conference game to the SEC harder format, non-division format, making it harder for teams to get into the playoff, as evidenced in their mind by Alabama, South Carolina, Ole Miss. The SEC not getting that 4th team in last year's playoff. If there's a guaranteed 4 bids, then that worry goes away. You could beat each other up, and there could be a team with 4 losses that could get in if they, and I'm sure you'll ask me about the format for a play-in weekend. But if that happens, and I was told by multiple athletic directors there that's what has to happen first, is the playoff format, and then they would get to the 9 games.
Yeah, Seth, a lot of people, when the news came out about the AQs, were puzzled. You seem to be answering that part of the bewilderment. I realize you're not an athletic director, you're a reporter and a writer, but can you explain their rationale? Because a lot of folks around the country, including some that work for the same pub that you do, just do not get it. They think the SEC and the Big Ten are looking really bad in all this.
I mean, I totally get it. And the Big Ten got 4 teams in last year. The SEC only, quote unquote, got 3. But if they expand to 14, then it would seem that the SEC is going to get 4 every year too. So why do you have to legislate it in? I think that is still very debatable. It seems that is just the Big Ten and the SEC saying that's what we can do. But this play-in format where they are reimagining championship weekend, reimagining being the word that they're throwing around, it's either what, I don't know whether it's chicken or the egg that came first. That play-in weekend could be a way to kind of soften the blow of the guaranteed bids, because it would add some excitement. It would, number one, remove the benefit of not having to play in the championship game. You remember, Paul, that debate last year where was Tennessee better off? Was this team, whoever, better off not playing in the SEC championship game? Was it a hurt? Well, in the play-in championship format, everybody will play that Saturday.
Okay,
but then there is debate over how you do that. And that was the news in terms of the newest thing to emerge, something that I learned in New Orleans, which was they're not just considering this format that's been out there for a while now, where 1 versus 2 would play for the conference championship in both the SEC and the Big Ten, as usual. But then 3 versus 6 and 4 versus 5 for the last 2 bids. That was interesting. But then I was told Tuesday night, like, watch out for a 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5 set of games instead. And I said, well, is that just, to showcase the other teams and give them a chance for a good win, but 1 and 2 would still get in regardless? I said, no, that would be it. I said, what? Like a undefeated, let's say, regular season champion in the SEC could be knocked out by losing to a mediocre number 8 seed? And they said, well, yeah, it's out of the box, Paul. And it might be nuts to people, but it's definitely under consideration. And the more I thought about it, I could see some benefits to it. Like, it's 4 games on play-in weekend instead of 3, for instance. It's 2 more teams, the 7th and 8th place teams, that are engaged, or their fan bases are engaged, and that it's interesting. And I guess the argument would be that, hey, if you're the number 1 seed and you lose to the number 8 seed in a situation where you have to win it to make the playoff, then no one's going to shed any tears for you missing the playoff. That's the argument. I'm not saying I agree with it, but it just goes to show, like, how really out of the box they're thinking right now.
Okay, Seth, I realize you're just a messenger here, and there's no easy way to put something on a canvas, but could you give it your best shot? Because I don't understand this playoff weekend. What do you think what's the most likely? What does it look like? And where are the games, and how are they staged?
Well, I obviously, all but one of them, you would think, have to be home sites. I don't know if there's a championship game and it's still 1 versus 2, that probably stays in Atlanta. Then the 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5 go to home sites, and 3 and 4 host. Then obvious, but if you do that, then one is going to complain and say, hey, we should get a home site, which is kind of the same thing that was happening this year with the playoff, where the top 4 seeds were like, why didn't we get a home game? So I think that's part of it. The 1 versus 8, the 4-game play-in weekend thing, even more so. Like, does Atlanta hosting an SEC championship game, is that just out? Because what's the championship game at that point? 1 versus 8? Like, no, like, wouldn't seem to. But yeah, I could see it being somebody plays Friday night, which, maybe you try to coordinate it so it's not a short week where, like, I don't know how you would, but maybe teams that played, because this would presumably fall Thanksgiving weekend, some of the teams that played on Thursday and Friday of Thanksgiving weekend, they would be the ones that would, like, play on a Friday night at 8 o'clock, and then you'd have another game Saturday at 1, another game at 4:30, another game at 8. or maybe you don't have to do a Friday night game if it's only 3 games, but it's a chance to just have another exciting weekend of games, but also a chance to have another weekend of more games that bring in more television money and bring in more gate receipts to the conference.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm sure they're smarter than we are. I'll say that just to get it out of the way. But for a CFP that's already going very long, according to everyone who participated last year and who covered it, Seth, just give me your best judgment being around these people. How committed are they to this SEC bonanza weekend, and will cooler heads prevail?
Well, the Big Ten initiated this, and the SEC was a more reluctant partner, and they've been more reluctant the whole time on the 4 guaranteed bids. They may have been swayed more towards it by the Big Ten idea of the championship weekend, and I'm not sure if the 4-game play-in weekend came from the SEC or came from the Big Ten, or maybe it was a television person, an outside consultant. I'm not sure, but I think that they're leaning that way. It doesn't mean that they're definitely going to do it in terms of having this championship weekend thing, but I do think that as much as I personally am a little put off by the idea of the guaranteed bids, the only way to kind of make it better, in my mind, is to have that format where there is a play-in. But I think there's also got to be a thought of, like, what if this is a long play where each league, the Big Ten and the SEC, are doing their own play-in weekend? How long before that becomes the playoff? You know, what if this idea of 1 versus 8, 4 versus 5, 2, 7, whatever, is just that's actually forming the SEC playoff. The Big Ten does the same thing, and then the 2 winners just play in the championship, and they ice out everybody else. That's probably a decade or more down the road, but that's kind of where my mind goes to.
Seth, many thanks. I hope to learn, and you gave us a lot of information, but my mind is about as jumbled and confused as it can be. Many, many thanks for sharing with us what you learned in New Orleans. We'll get the reaction from everybody out there as we move through the afternoon. John Wilner on that as well. And we got a comedian to lighten everything up. We'll need it. Your call.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
We are back, and let's get some phone calls in reaction, because there is a lot to discuss after what Seth Emerson just said. Robert is up next. Hello, Robert. Robert, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Well, go right ahead. You're on the air.
Paul? Okay. Sorry, Paul. I know you looked confused. I'm really confused now. What exactly are they trying to do? Listening to Seth just blew my mind away.
Yeah, no, it's bad enough that or confusing enough that they're talking about these AQs, but this SEC championship weekend, I mean, I need somebody to explain it, because that is completely bewildering. To give everyone an extra game where you could end up playing 5. Yeah, I mean, if you go all the way to the championship game, you could play 5 extra games.
Exactly. I really just don't understand. I don't know. I'm just a dumb old Kentucky boy. But
I mean, you tell me. We could think about what it would have looked like this past season. Yeah, I mean, I realize the games are important, but what is the appetite for people to go to a couple more home games in December? Possibility of questionable weather, and just the argument you hear on the other side is how much do you want to subject these young people to?
Well, I agree. I don't know.
I'll hold my fire a little bit until I can maybe get somebody to explain it. But right now, I am about as confused as you are. Thank you for the call. Appreciate it. Swamp Dog, maybe he can explain it.
Well, I hope I can, Paul, but I don't think so. I tell you what, man, every day I go back to the old Bob Seger song. I wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then.
Yeah, wow.
Because it just gets worse every day. My God, the season's already as long as it is, and I hear a lot of people saying it's already too long. You know, it's as long as a NFL season. And now, what they say, you gotta have and I already told you I don't like the 4 automatic bids in the first place. Now you gotta play another game.
Yeah,
just to be
and
qualified
Dog,
for
let
one.
me talk about this. I mean, what's getting to the SEC championship game is really great for the fan base. It's a celebration. It's in the biggest city in the SEC. They honor the legends. You know, whether you're a Georgia fan or a Texas fan, you've got a rooting interest in the game if you want to show up. But now you're going to fragment it into 3 or 4 different places, and you have a Friday night game. By the way, that Friday night game will be in direct competition with high school football, I think.
There you go.
At least in Georgia. I know it's in Georgia. I don't know about elsewhere, but I know Georgia plays pretty late, don't they?
Yes, sir, they do. Yeah, about 8 o'clock. You know, I mean, it's just they go on. Yeah, it takes a while to finish that year and everything, but I don't know, man. It's just I don't know where they're going with this thing. Like I said, it's I don't see. There's nobody that has an answer to it. Nobody has an answer for this.
I don't mind them throwing things up against the wall, but it doesn't sound like that's what they're doing. I mean, they are moving toward this, and whether it's the Big Ten's idea or not, we'll continue to talk about it. Irvin is up next in Georgia. Hey, Irvin.
Yes, sir. How you doing?
We are doing great.
And you hit it dead on the head. We do have football games here on Friday nights, and sometimes we don't finish till 10, 11 o'clock at night. It depends on the weather, and it depends on who's playing. But, Paul, didn't I mention it to you a week or so ago about sooner or later we're going to have an 8-4 team. You just mentioned it. We're going to have an 8-4 team in the playoffs. And it's ridiculous. I just don't understand it. It's a money thing to the Big Ten more so than the SEC. But it's what I mentioned earlier. And I hate to say it again. You're trying to keep teams like Alabama, Georgia, LSU, and Tennessee. You're trying to keep them relevant. More so Alabama. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Irvin. Always fun to talk to you. And let's check out Jack up next in South Carolina. Hello, Jack.
Hey, Paul.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing good. I'm down here in South Carolina, talking about the Big Ten and SEC, and I've had a problem, but because everybody's talking about how the Big Ten is like such a better conference than the SEC, you know?
Right.
And I really don't like them talking about that because the Big Ten is like the top 4 really good teams, and the rest of them are just horrible.
Yeah, I
would like your thoughts on that.
Jack, you could have a year where there really isn't a number 4 Big Ten team.
That's true.
I mean, this year, I guess it would have been you had Michigan, you had Ohio. It would have been, I guess, you had Indiana, Ohio State, Penn State, and Oregon. I mean, they would have been okay this year, but not every year. And same for the SEC. The 4th team in the SEC this year was either Alabama, Ole Miss, or South Carolina. All flawed.
And I just feel like that the SEC is a lot more deeper than the Big Ten when it comes to, like, every team's at least pretty good, you know?
Hey, you're right. Hey, listen, thank you very much for your call. We're up against the break. We have a lot more to react to. We're trying to make a little bit of sense out of it all, and we'll lean on you to do that as we come back.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
This tomorrow, State goes to Norman, Ole Miss at Vanderbilt, and the Gators take their lofty ranking down to Baton Rouge. We continue, and Jackson is up next. Hello, Jackson.
Paul, I want to go over my take on the CFP expansion, and I got to tell you, it worries me a little bit, but on the other hand, we can see some fun games from either a 16-team playoff or a 14-team playoff, although it does worry me about the future of the Notre Dame-USC rivalry after 2026, especially when I'm hearing the USC athletic directors say in an ideal world.
I had not heard that, but there's been some speculation about Notre Dame trying to keep up with the Big Ten and the SEC, and I wonder if Notre Dame would ever consider breaking its ACC arrangement and forming a new deal with the joint SEC Big Ten.
I think it could happen. I think the Big Ten will probably get Notre Dame to join at some point, or better yet, NBC's going to get Notre Dame to join the Big Ten. Because, I mean, I looked at the ratings for Notre Dame, Florida State. They were low compared to, like, the ratings of Notre Dame, Purdue in week 3. And I think that could happen in the next few years.
Well,
Maybe not.
The problem is at the ACC, when you play 5 ACC games, I mean, you don't know if any of them are going to be worth watching.
Yeah, because, I mean, I think NBC's keeping an eye on that for sure.
Well, they have to. Thanks for the call. Really do appreciate it. Let's continue with more phone calls here. And Luann is in Oregon. Hello, Luann.
Thank you for taking my call.
Thank
I
you.
want to go back to the Pac-12. We do better, less travel. We're what are we, number 3 now? And yet we have the best ratings of the year. And somebody's going to say, okay, we're going to pick and choose here and there. Don't lose your fan base. You've got to have your fan base to keep everything going. That's my point.
Well, you do, but you also need financial security, and I think that has played a big role in what Oregon did.
Looks like it's more of a money thing, but we had better fun times watching our men and women at home instead of having them all over the place. That's just what a lot of us, as the fans of the Oregon Ducks,
but ultimately, you do have to meet a payroll, and that's why Oregon did what it did. Thank you very, very much. Brad is up next in Georgia. Hey, Brad.
Hey, Paul. Earlier in the week, you put up the Florida Gator 2025 football schedule.
Right.
And something jumped out at me. They're opening up with a team called Long Island Brooklyn. And I'd never heard of that team, so I kind of looked into it, and it's a FCS school. They were 4-8 last year in their little dinky conference. They played one Division I school, which was TCU, and got beat 45-0. So they're going to travel down to Gainesville and pick up a check. And it's just not going to be good football. Well, why don't they go to something like the basketball when you have the SEC Big Ten Challenge? Why don't they play a 9-game conference schedule, all 4 of your Power 5, I guess you'd say 5, but Power 4, and you got 3 games, and then you play somebody in another conference, in a D1 conference like the Big 12 or whatever, and you just kind of rotate that around each year. That way, after 12 games, me being a football viewer, I don't have really a team, and I would be able to see Florida play Georgia Tech, or, a better matchup than playing Long Island Brooklyn Sharks. Everybody would be playing D1 schedule from the top to the bottom, and you just kind of rotate them around each year. That way, when the rankings come out, you don't have to say, well, we played a tougher schedule. Well, if you play, if Minnesota comes down and plays Mississippi State, well, that'd probably be a halfway watchable game. But these schools playing these rinky-dink schools, you can't do that in football. You can do it in baseball and you can do it in basketball, but you can't do it in football because in the long run, I mean, looking at the schedule now, Long Island, that team just jumped out at me. That
no, you're right. And Brad, thank you for the call. It's one of the worst opening games I have ever seen. There's just no reason for it, and I feel sorry for fans on what will likely be a 95-degree early evening for that game. I'm sure it's going to be at night. Who really wants to see it? I mean, it's just completely unwatchable. I agree. Thank you for the call. Dave is in Hartford, Connecticut. Hello, Dave.
Hey, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
So, I live in Connecticut. I'm a huge fan of the Yukon Huskies. Do you consider them a blue blood?
In basketball, I do, yes.
Yeah. But do you think that also, do you think that the SEC and the ACC, which has been a better conference? Like, I think this year, the SEC, but like overall,
Well, Dave, overall, the ACC has been the bellwether basketball conference since the beginning of time. But in recent years, it has dropped off dramatically.
Do you think the SEC has a chance to become that better conference if this continues?
Well, I think all you can do is look at today. There's a reason why the SEC is doing so well. It's not something that happened overnight. It's a long ascension of good facilities and particularly in particular great coaches. And I think that I think if you look at the ACC, what is noteworthy? Well, you lost a national championship winning coach at Virginia. You lost iconic coaches at North Carolina, one of the greatest coaches in basketball history at Duke, and you're losing another one at Florida State. You lost one at Miami. You lost one at Syracuse. I think it's really catching up. Now, some of those situations were necessary. I mean, Boeheim should have gone years ago, but ultimately, you're talking about generational coaches who have departed or are departing the ACC right now, and I think it really has taken its toll. Thank you for the call. I do appreciate it. Why don't we continue here and check in with Rick next. Hey, Rick.
Hey, good afternoon, Paul. So I got about three things for you. First two have to do with some callers from yesterday.
Okay.
First off, our boy Bash out in Boulder, Paul, whining and crying, and he sounds like what rhymes with witch. If you catch my drift yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And then I know she's one of your favorites, but Sheila was talking about how Auburn is the real Tigers. I mean, Paul, give me a break. They got a good basketball team this year, but when's the last time Auburn won anything? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, LSU's won a national championship in baseball, gymnastics, women's basketball, and football since Auburn's won a national championship in anything. Am I not right?
I believe you are correct.
So, Paul,
excuse me, breaking news, Auburn won the golf championship.
You're right. They did win the golf championship. My bad for forgetting about golf. Hey, Paul, but the other day a gentleman asked you what you were reading lately, and you mentioned that you had read, I want to say something by Daniel Silva, but then you mentioned that you were rereading the Eye of the Needle by Ken Follett. Absolutely terrific book, Paul. I mean, I read it probably like you many years ago, and Ken Follett, to me, was the only guy I would say that was right on the level with Robert Ludlum. But
I mean, years when Ludlum came out, Ludlum ultimately died, but back in the 70s and 80s, he was easily my favorite author. I did read some La Curie. I mean, most people consider him the ultimate spy novelist. But The Eye of the Needle, I had not read it in 30 years until I read it recently. It was pretty chilling. Hey, thank you for the call. Really appreciate it, Rick. We're up against the break. More to come. More of your phone calls. We are right back here.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
It's coming up, and what an afternoon into early evening this is going to be. 7 Eastern, LSU and Kentucky, two of the best squads in America, and then another Iron Bowl. Auburn at Alabama. Let's check in with John, who is up next. Hello, John.
Hey, how's it going, Paul?
We are doing great, thank you.
Hey, so just real quick, I mean, my observation is that it's meant to be confusing. The whole CFB is just confusing the whole thing, and it's brilliant because it's going to get people talking. People are going to be upset. People are going to be confused. And it's just going to drive more people to want to figure it out, which is going to keep it, relevant. But the other observation I have is with the NCAA being pretty much pushed aside and you have the Big Ten and the SEC, well, there's a lot of money here. Who's actually in charge? Can you answer that? I mean, who's the one making the ultimate decision? Before it was the NCAA. Now they're not really
by the way,
there.
John, you have just identified a really interesting question there. In terms of enforcement, nobody is in charge.
Yeah.
Nobody will be in charge. What the Big Ten and the SEC are really trying to do is set the template for the immediate future. For many, many years, the Power Five commissioners have essentially run college football. Basketball runs itself. I mean, you still have more jurisdiction with the NCAA because they own the tournament. They don't have anything to do with the football postseason.
But I guess my question is it's like you had one big business, you had the eldest statesman sitting at the head of the table, which would have been the NCAA. Then you had the two cousins sitting across from each other, which was the Big Ten and the SEC, and eldest statesman's now gone. Who's running the company? I mean, I don't know. I'm just trying to make sense of it all because it doesn't.
It's
it just seems like they're just trying to make.
There really isn't anyone running it. They're like we're into essentially tribalism, where everybody's running their own tribe, and it just so happens that the SEC and the Big Ten are the biggest, and they can influence. So they have formed a cabal, so to speak, and they're trying to have like-minded approaches to the issues.
Now, is this going to translate to other sports, like basketball, baseball?
Yeah. No, I mean, everything. It's not only football, although football is the most important thing. But yeah, I think you're going to see joint arrangements between the two leagues in a lot of things. Absolutely. Hey, thank you very much for the call. I mean, this is not breaking news. That for at least about 15 years, the commissioners of they used to call it the Autonomous Five. Those are the Power Five conferences. There's one less now. They essentially wrested the power from the NCAA. It wasn't in time because the NCAA, being the inept bureaucracy that it is, still managed to screw up NIL about as badly as you could, and that's why we're seeing this massive billion-dollar settlement about to be approved, which is costing everyone a small fortune and essentially putting a number of programs in dire straits. But and everyone has some blame in that, but it's primarily the stubbornness and the ineptitude of the former NCAA leader, and the fact that presidents of schools and power brokers allowed the NCAA to have the power for as long as it did. I mean, right now you have an NCAA president, Charlie Baker. He has no real power. I mean, he basically is a former governor who may be doing more harm than good, but he's essentially a paid lobbyist, a very well-paid lobbyist, by the way. Let's check in with John, who is up next.
How you doing, Mr. Paul Finebaum?
We are doing great, thank you.
Yes, sir. I just wanted to talk to you about the playoffs and all that.
Right.
Yes, sir. I believe the reason the playoffs is going the way it's going because the NBA and the college basketball, like all those like playoffs and stuff like that is being added on more, and I think the college football wants to do that too, just to try to catch up.
Well, John, thank you for your call. Appreciate it. Roger is up next. Hey, Roger, go right ahead.
Hey. Well, I thought John was on from Alabama. Paul, I'd like to ask you, the Big Ten and SEC are the two conferences. And instead of playing somebody, I'm Florida fan. And, well, anyway, that's beside the point. But why don't you, instead of Long Beach, whatever, hell, I seen that schedule. Hell, I had to look up to see who the hell they were. And hey, Paul, how you doing?
Yeah, hey, Roger.
Now,
Roger, we hear you. Keep going. Don't worry about the sound, okay?
I hate to see you leaving North Carolina, going back to Alabama. But why don't they just let and play like Indiana, play Florida, first game of the year?
Well, let me explain, Roger, and thank you for your call. I mean, everybody's got conference games. Right now, 8. So you schedule for Florida. They always have a game against Florida State, so that's 9. So they have 3 more games to play with. They have South Florida, and then this year they have Miami. So they play 2 Power 5 games. So they just looked for what's called they played UCF as well. So I mean it's just it's a terrible game, and there's no way around it. John Wilner will educate us in a minute.